Are you tired of the same old curdled dairy products? Can't find anything better than cheddar? Was Swiss and swing and a miss? No more Havarti at the party? Maybe it's time to take your curds up a notch with radio cheese, the most uniquely American cheese since American cheese. For a food staple that's been around for centuries, folks sure haven't done much innovating lately, at least until now. We at Cultured Foods have strived for food futurism and brought so many exciting new products to our customers over the years. Dr. Spatnik's Pocket Lunch, Breakfast Bombs, Old Time Pam's Fancy Ham, the Brisket Bucket, and now, Radio Cheese. Cultured Foods believes that food should be bold, shiny, and new. Case in point, cheese with a plug-a-growin' bright radium right in the middle. Now wait a minute, you might say. I heard radium isn't good for people. Well, friend, I don't quite trust those lab rat scientists with their fancy words. Now, what I do know is that I trust Cultured Foods foodologists and expert eaters. And they all say, if it ain't glowing, it ain't going. Home with me. So the next time your lovely wife is going to do the shopping, make sure she tells Deli Dan, milk and rennet, curds and whey, it's a radio cheese day. And coming soon from Cultured Foods, the Zoot Suit of Fruit, the first gentleman's wear made entirely of fruit leather. Patent pending. Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a highly fixated review of large, dense books, specifically of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
My name is Cody.
I'm Will.
I'm Luke.
And today we are going to be discussing Shadow Ticket, a lovely sort of surprise publication from Thomas Pynchon this year that was announced several months ago. I think like March was when they said something, right?
I think it was April because
March, April.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, I want to say it was April. I don't know.
Yeah,
prove me wrong, somebody.
But how exciting to get any more material from the man at all. Certainly, even more so exciting that it covers a period that had previously kind of been not, I want to say a gaping hole in his work, but the Great Depression. There certainly had not been something set in or around that time frame. And so as a result, we kind of, as he has been working towards, and as we've talked about over the course of several of our episodes, this kind of alternate history of the United States through the 1900s. We've got the book covering the early 1900s, this being the Great Depression, then the end of World War II, the time just after World War II, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and all of that leading up to eventually 9/11 with Bleeding Edge. So what do we think about this book? Who wants to start with kind of general thoughts on the book? Did it satisfy you guys as a Pynchon novel? How do you feel like this compares to other work that he has written? Did it match your expectations? Was it different than what you expected? Who wants to start?
I'll go ahead and jump in here. I actually finished my second reading of it this morning, and I actually enjoyed it significantly more on the second read through. I think part of that is due to the fact that the first reading, I was just excited to have that book in my hands and really just kind of plow through it. And with every Pynchon novel that I've picked up, really with every book that I read, I always just go in on a surface level at first, just enjoy the book on its own merits, enjoy the story, the plot, and then I'll go back if I want to dive back into it and do a little bit more of a thorough read after that. And so my second reading, which I slowed down a little bit, I really kind of I started taking some notes, and then I realized there's no possible way I can really get as much done as I want in time to finish it for this. So I just kind of like kept going and marked a few things here and there. But I think the biggest thing that changed for me was my appreciation of the ending. I remember the first read through, I finished it, I closed it, and I thought, okay, that was fine. The second time when I finished it this morning, it really hit a lot closer and resonated a lot more. And I think that sort of elevated it as far as how I appreciate it next to his other novels. Um, we'll get more into the general reception and I think how we each feel about how the book has been received a little bit later, but I will say personally, I really enjoyed it. It's definitely not my favorite of his works, but there's also the recency bias and, who knows where 5 years, 10 years down the road where this book is gonna land for me. But that being said, I would rank it in the probably top half of his work. I really enjoyed the characters, I enjoy the writing, the dialogue is fantastic. It's a fun read, but there is a lot going on under the surface that I think just needs more examination and more, um, in-depth review, and at some point we'll get there, and I'm excited for that.
Can I ask what your biggest changes were in your estimation of it, other than the ending between your first reading and your second reading?
As far as, like, what changed as how I was appreciating it,
Yeah, or
like,
receiving
what
it.
I
Yeah.
appreciated, I think what it was, the initial read through, I was really just enjoying the noir, the detectives part of it. It reads so much like a Chandler or a Hammett
It really
or
does.
a James Cain novel, and that's not to say that it is stealing from that or that it's copying that. It's done in a very Pynchon way. It really feels like it was written in that time, much like Mason and Dixon, because of the language that's being used. It's so authentic. It's not hammy or corny. So I was just really enjoying the ride, as it
Mhm.
were, and I was just really liking the story, seeing where it was taking me. Um, the second time around is when I started to kind of piece together a lot more of what he was getting at thematically. And I think that's kind of what helped it resonate a lot more for me, is to see where all of these pieces are starting to connect, not just with his themes in this book, but how this book connects to everything else that he has done. And there are, just from this second read through, there's a ton of connections between this book and all of his others, the obvious being Against the Day.
Mhm.
But it's, yeah, aside from it being a Pynchon novel and it's sort of, foreboding warning of like, here's what's to come if we don't do something about it kind of thing. There's a lot more that's going on as far as what causes us as a society, specifically, if we're looking at this from what's causing America to have this, I don't even want to call it a slow march towards fascism, because at this point there's people that are sprinting towards the finish line.
Yeah.
So it really does a very good job of examining how that happens. What tools are put in place by the government, by the capitalist forces, what is there to distract people from what's going on so that they can be led in the right direction. And if they're not pushed in the right direction, how do we push them far enough off the path that we don't have to worry about them anymore? It does a really good job of looking at how all of that is happening behind the scenes. But there's a lot, as with any Pynchon novel, there's so much subtlety to everything. You really like, I'm gonna have to reread this book 4 or 5 times before I really start to feel like I have a good grasp of it. And I genuinely think every subsequent read through I do is just going to make me appreciate this novel a little bit more.
Okay. Luke, Will, what did you guys think of this book?
I am struggling with formulating my thoughts on this book because, um, on one level, I think that it is incredibly beautifully written. I think
Yeah.
that pound for pound, it might be his most beautifully written book. And at the same time, it also might be his most traditionally, uh, I guess I'll say structured novel. It's not so much that the structure is traditional, but more that the ambitions don't seem to be beyond tradition
Mhm.
with the sheer quantity of characterization that's going
Mhm.
on. Uh, I I'm I have nothing negative to say except that my first read through, and I'm about halfway through my second. The the first 150 pages, I would say, were extremely easy to just treat as stream of consciousness, which doesn't really work with this book. Like just letting the language flow over me was not the right strategy. It's not a huge problem with the book itself, but it's one of those things where it's Pynchon. I want to be able to do that. I want to just let the noises jangle in my head until something comes of it, and that's not really how this one worked. So I was a little bit taken aback, but I can't say I'm disappointed in any way. Nor can I say that I am able to, off the bat, designate it as one of my particular favorites. But as it stands, I would not be surprised if it did, and I also wouldn't be surprised if it didn't. Like Cody said, I think this. Or wait, did Cody say this? What is up with my brain? Sorry. Whether he did or didn't, this may well be the go-to, like, hey, if you want to read Pynchon, read Shadow Ticket. But, like I said, I'm still a fair bit undetermined about how I feel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely enjoyed the novel on my first read. I've only read it once. I liked it. I'm not sure if I remember my first read. I think a big moment for me was whenever the first about 150 pages are very focused on Hicks, and and then we jumped to him being on the ship, and I remember like the British intelligence couple is introduced, and the narrative eventually moves away from Hicks for a page or two, and I remember thinking, while like Pynchon has been very focused in this novel so far, and he's showing a lot of restraint by not, going on and on about this British couple, that at that point it wasn't clear if they were British intelligence or not, and they were like fairly interesting. But I just was really loving the narrative or the narration focusing on Hicks so much up until that point that I remember thinking, I hope we continue to focus on Hicks.
Yep.
And by the end of the novel, like, I read some reviews that say that we stay focused on Hicks throughout the novel, and I have to kind of disagree. I mean, by the end of the novel, there's a fair amount of stuff that happens without Hicks. It's not clear if Hicks is there or without Hicks at all. And I just wish that he had stayed focused on Hicks more, I guess, throughout the novel, because I loved a lot of the digressions and the subplots. For a lot of them, by the time I finished the book, were kind of felt underdeveloped, or that he didn't do as much with a cool idea as he could have. I did read one review that said that the reviewer would, if they were Pynchon, that they would have cut the first half in half and then quadrupled the size of the second half. And I do kind of understand that urge. I'm not sure if I agree. I just could have read a whole book about Hicks, tooling around in Milwaukee, I guess.
Yeah, me too.
I've never been to Milwaukee, but I was talking to my dad about it, and he's been to Milwaukee, and he says that it's, at least somewhat similar to Syracuse, where I spent the first 13 years of my life. And I did notice some similarities there as I was reading it. Just it's like a northern, kind of more industrial, more like lower middle class city. At least Syracuse is. I've never been to Milwaukee, but yeah, I mean, I liked it overall. I agree that I definitely liked it more than V or Bleeding Edge, probably. In terms of, it's not. I feel like he could have written a much longer novel about this time period and covered a lot of the same ground and just expanded upon stuff. Overall, I enjoyed the first read, and it is the kind of novel that, like y'all were saying, like the language is very entertaining. It's a lot of the dialogue is really cool. It's much more dialogue heavy than some of his other novels, which I did like. There's a lot to like about the novel. And a lot of my kind of nitpicks are just, differences and like it's basically just amounts to like stylistic choices. So
yeah. So I have only read the book once as well. And I did enjoy it. I will say that I think the first half of this book, for me anyway, is the more successful part of it to me than the second half of it. And I am very curious how my feelings on the book will change after reading it again, because it is very clear that there's other stuff that I probably did not pick up fully on, or was not able to kind of fully synthesize the meaning out of the text of it being present there. Those elements that kind of Luke mentioned where they crop up, but it doesn't feel like they have a full sort of conclusion, or that more could have been done with them. That is a lot of how I feel about the second half of this book, and I am curious if, upon finishing Against the Day, if my opinion will change, because for a book that kind of wants to analyze the rise of fascism and the kind of death trip towards World War II of all of this accelerationism and everything, it feels like a lot of that is missing from the second half. Like, there are certainly references to it, and there are certainly kind of elements going on in the background that depict sort of the rise of the security state or espionage apparatuses, and how things are slowly starting to go in a pretty sinister direction. All of that is there. I guess I expected more. And it's interesting that the book spends so much time in characterization of Hicks, which I love. I loved the first 100 or so pages of this book, where you really, really get to know this one guy and how it is that he's ended up the way that he is, kind of his doomed relationship with April, and all of the stuff going on in Milwaukee was so good. And I agree with Luke in that I could have just read a novel about him, and I would have loved that. But it feels like there's just not enough space in the second half of this book to do everything that Pynchon wants to do, or to do everything that Pynchon is gesturing towards. And part of me, like I had mentioned, was curious if my feeling on that would change after having read Against the Day, because any sort of student of history of the time period knows that, fascism sure reached its kind of zenith in the late 30s and 40s, but Mussolini created the fascist party in Italy in 1919, 1920. So it was around for a while, and it was getting going for a decade or so prior to that. So and I'm sure there's some of that in Against the Day. Of course, I haven't read the entirety of that book yet. But yeah, I think that the language is beautiful. I agree completely with Will that this is probably his most consistently beautifully written book as far as the prose. And I think my biggest takeaway, I was reminded a lot of The Long Goodbye, the Robert Altman film, when I was reading this, in that both Hicks and that version of
Philip Marlowe.
Yes, thank you. Philip Marlowe are both being strung along and controlled by forces that are just constantly right out of view, and being pushed towards things that the meaning of which they don't totally understand, and why it's happening to them they don't totally understand. So that was something that was coming up constantly, but also in that like sharpened focus of a spotlight being placed on one character. And there's been a lot of motifs in Pynchon's work that come up in this again. Doomed romance, kind of a specific central couple that seems like they're kind of meant to be together, but it just doesn't work out for one reason or another. And Hicks has a lot in common with a lot of his other characters in that regard, not just his relationship, but also his background and what he does. And it feels like he is kind of the apotheosis of that character, in that we get to watch him develop. We get to watch that relationship dissolve. We get to hear about his backstory leading up to who he is now. And then we also get the sort of Pynchonian kind of getting lost in a maze of bureaucratic indignity of it all. Whereas with a lot of his other characters, you maybe get one of those, but not all of it. And that was really great. And I think that's why I loved the Milwaukee section of it so much, because it really felt like Pynchon introduced me to a character and then brought me through that character's sort of life up to this moment, and then also kind of put me behind his eyes as he continued to get pushed and pulled around until eventually he ends up in Europe. And then he kind of disappears from the back half of this book, especially after the kind of narrative thrust moves to the motorcycle race. And I was sad about that. This is a really great character that Pynchon had created, and I was loving that perspective and the way that he gets buoyed about by all these different forces. And while I was enjoying everything else, I kind of just yearned to go back to Milwaukee in a way. And maybe that's purposeful. Maybe Pynchon has specifically written the book that way to give the reader a similar experience to what Hicks is experiencing. And if that's the case, that's great. But I don't know if I necessarily felt that thematically or sort of emotionally while I was reading the book. I think a lot of that came in hindsight. But I don't want any of that kind of light criticism to make it seem like it's not a book worth reading or that I didn't enjoy it. I really enjoyed reading the book, and I do agree that this is probably a better introduction to Pynchon than Lot 49. Lot 49 is shorter, but I would say that even though it is shorter, the work he's doing is denser. And some of the themes that are more broadly explored as it relates to kind of his detective characters and relationships and all of that in this book, I think will give you a good introduction to stuff that is a motif through the rest of his sort of bibliography. So yeah, it was lovely. I don't remember the name of the listener, so I apologize in advance, but we got an email a little while ago asking if I was excited about there being a book being set in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, which is where I live. And it was so much fun. Like to follow up on that email, it was great. Like, yes, I was looking forward to it, but also experiencing it was really awesome. I've spent a lot of time in Milwaukee. And to kind of have one of my favorite authors write about it in a way that made it clear that he at least understood some of the city's history, had probably at least been there, and that he makes references to very specific neighborhoods and very specific identities in those neighborhoods is great. I had mentioned to that listener in response to his email that like Milwaukee was a very heavily segregated city, like amongst different nationalities, to the point where in some regards people who have lived there for a long time or in the surrounding areas still feel that way. This isn't someone from my family, but a coworker of mine told me that he went back to Milwaukee with his dad once, and the way that they were driving through the city, his dad went, "What are we doing in the Polish neighborhood?" So Milwaukee does still have some of this deep-seated, frankly, racist inclinations from a lot of people, but also these very distinct sort of neighborhoods and communities. And Pynchon does reference that with the kind of heavily Italian presence in the Third Ward community in Milwaukee. Or these different sort of elements of Wisconsin locations and references to other aspects of Wisconsin. It was so much fun. The fact that Boynt Crosstown has a bottle of Corbel brandy in his desk is the most Wisconsin thing that Pynchon could have possibly written into the book. There is a restaurant that was featured on the Food Network because it's called the Old Fashioned, and that's basically like our state cocktail. And if you ever go to this restaurant, it's in the state's capital. They do hundreds of Old Fashions a day, and if you walk to the bar area, there are just liter bottles upon liter bottles upon liter bottles of Corbel brandy just up on the shelves. So getting the details right as it related to setting a book in Wisconsin was an additionally really awesome experience for me reading this book. The fact that he brought up the police boxes that people sat in when it was too cold outside this was an experience that I had when I moved to Wisconsin from Chicago originally. My family originally moved to northern Wisconsin, but these are kind of ubiquitous through a lot of the state. There was all these like little, for lack of a better term, like phone booths or boxes at the edges of people's driveways. And we kept seeing them everywhere until eventually my mom, I think it was, just asked one of our neighbors, like, what are those about? And she said, oh, that in the winter, that's for the kids to wait for the bus. So like even these like little details of, you know, the fact that there are these like little shelters that are not heated, but you know, there's some walls and there's some straw, which helps you stay slightly warmer than you would be outside in the winter.
Yeah.
It was delightful to see all of that represented. It felt like a book set in a place that I know very well. And so I think that also probably underpinned a lot of my desire to be like, yeah, Pinchon, give me more Wisconsin stuff. But yeah, those are my overall thoughts on the book. I did enjoy it.
Well, I want to. Sorry, I want to jump in real quick before it leaves my brain. I'm glad you mentioned that feeling you got about the way that the novel went with regards to Hicks, and Luke brought this up too, with regard to Hicks not being the central focus in the latter half of the book. And I think this is something that came up in my second reading. I think that's very intentional. I think specifically if you take into consideration the name of the book and how often the idea or the concept of not the concept, the actual like physical manifestation of a ticket comes into play in this book. A ticket gets you from one place to another, whether you make the choice to go or you're given a ticket. Hicks is always given a ticket. He has no say in where it is he's going. He's always just kind of put onto these boats, and here you go. You know, you're going here. You have no say in it. If you want to try to push back, it's not going to go well for you. So you're just stuck, and that's the same as reading a book, right? You're stuck on the path that book is taking you, whether you like it or not. Whether you think it's where it should go, it doesn't matter. It's going where it's going, and you're on for that ride. You signed up. That's your ticket. You're on that path. And at the end of all of that, Hicks comes back to an America that's not America that he knew when he left. So that it's sort of like a Lord of the Rings kind of thing, where you know, in a time of war, you leave, and when you come back, the place that you left is never the same. And there's a kind of disappointment that comes with that. So I get the feeling that was a very intentional move by Pinchon to have that feeling of disconnection from what it feels like it's supposed to be about versus what's really going on, and your ability to control that.
Yeah, that's fair. And I definitely do see that for sure. I guess for me anyway, I think that I would have felt better about it if the book was longer to more properly express those ideas.
Gotcha.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as many problems as I had with the back half, the very end of the book, I did very much enjoy. Like the actual ending, especially with the letter from Skeet Wheeler, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's, you know, that, and there's a quote that keeps on coming up in reviews. That's I think either in the last chapter or the penultimate chapter that I can't really quote from memory, but there's just some really beautiful passages there at the end. And you know, as somewhat, it does initially scan as kind of random that it's Skeet Wheeler who's writing a letter at the end. That being said, I mean, you know, you can draw an obvious line between Skeet Wheeler to Zoid Wheeler. Just kind of, you know, and as Vineland is kind of about the rise of, or certain types of conservatism and the rise of fascism in America. It does kind of draw a line between those two, and I do find the novel a lot more timely than some other reviewers, which I did, and I enjoyed that aspect of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess after hearing y'all talk about how you felt about Hicks' disappearance, maybe maybe you are supposed to read the first like 150, 200 pages as though it's a fever dream. Because I don't know, I got to the point where I was feeling like, oh, well, this is Hicks becoming less narcissistic. This is Hicks recognizing the world outside of himself. Because so much of the first 150 pages are just Hicks talking to his friends. And there's no concern beyond that. Everything that would in other books of Pynchon's be like an info dump moment is brushed aside extremely quickly, even though there's a ton of density to unpack that in another book Pynchon might have taken the time to do. But like, especially when I got to the end and I was reading about these other characters, sure, I was missing Hicks a little bit, but I was also thinking, well, I'm glad we're getting to see these other characters doing things. I'm glad it's not just Hicks wandering around hearing random jokes on the side of the street anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think there's something about Skip being the one who writes the letter that really closes that for me. Or not closes it, but like makes that like transformation of Hicks from just a self-centered PI to someone who, even if he might not be able to do anything to make the world a better place, at least has his head on straight. Comes from like, Skeet is like this little kid who attaches to him like a big brother. And he's the character who I felt like, because sure, Hicks and April's romance seemed lovely. And I thought it was maybe Pynchon's best meet cute.
Agreed.
But like, April clearly was not committed, and Hicks was looking for something more committed. And so when that ends, all right, whatever. You know, I'm not missing Uncle Lefty. I'm not missing, I'm really not missing most of these random people in Milwaukee, and you get the sense Hicks doesn't. But
Yeah.
But then at the end, it's Skeet saying, "Hey man, where'd you go?" And that really that was a bit of a gut punch for me. So I think that's how I feel about his disappearance. I guess, relatively speaking, disappearance.
To go back to something Cody said about Hicks' lack of agency, there's a few different parts of this book that did remind me of the movie Brazil, especially the part in like the office with the tubes and the messages flying everywhere, and just kind of the general way that Hicks has shuffled through all of these, scenarios in which he is facing forces that he can't understand and that are really shadowy and stuff. I mean, it's also unclear sometimes if these people are who in the second half of the novel, especially, because Hicks doesn't know these people, if these people are who they say they are, a lot of them, which I find very interesting. And this book is, I mean, it has a lot of energy for it being such a, Pynchon is 88 at this point. But the novel, I mean, it's very propulsive in a lot of ways. Like, I wouldn't call it boring at all. There are times when I felt a little lost and stuff, but that's not the worst thing to feel on your first read of a Pynchon novel.
I think that's kind of the perfect way to describe it. It does move. It has a lot of energy. And that's, I think, another reason why I, despite sort of my quibbling with it, that it still is really good, and ultimately why I was left wanting more of that, where it's because of that energy, because of that propulsiveness at times, like literally, given that a portion of this takes place during a race, that it just, I wasn't kind of ready for it to stop, and I guess maybe the text, at least to me anyway, felt like it wasn't ready to stop either. Yeah, that's a very smart way to put it, Luke. What did we think of the actual sort of writing of the book? How do we feel about the prose or the dialogue? A couple of us have mentioned thinking that it's written particularly excellently. Did we have any particular favorite aspects of the plot or scenes in the book?
I think it's been said, I think, by all of us at this point, that the writing is fantastic, especially in the first half. The dialogue, I remember the first night I sat down with it, I was just kind of blown away by how smooth it was. A lot of times with Pynchon's books, and it's not a slight against his work or anything, but I find that I really have to. It's harder for me, I guess, to hear the characters talk while I'm reading, which is normally how when I read, I can kind of hear in my head what I think the characters would sound like talking, and I have a harder time with some of his books than others. But this one was just perfectly written in such a way that I could hear everyone sound. It just sounded natural and vibrant, and the pacing, especially in the first half, is phenomenal. It is just a brilliant ride. It never feels like there's no real slog. I mean, it's a 300-page book, but even a short book can have parts that kind of feel like they're dragging, and I never felt like that was happening with this one. But as I said at the top of the episode, it feels very, very much like a Chandler or a Hammett novel. The way he has structured his sentences, there's not really so much of the long wall of texts, for better or worse, really. His descriptions are just as beautiful as in any of his books, but they're a little bit more focused and a little bit more have a little bit more clarity to them. There's not as much that feels as dense or as what's the wording I'm looking for here. I never feel like I'm kind of in a fog when I'm reading it, which is a cool thing to have in some of his books, and it really definitely lends itself towards those sections of those books where you kind of get that haze, and you as a reader maybe can't remember what happened a page ago because you're just so lost in everything that's going on and all the words that are coming at you. But it didn't really ever happen in this book, and I don't think it needed to. I think this is a really good showcase of how he has developed as a writer over the years. We talked about this with Bleeding Edge too, where people criticize it, and one of the first things I saw when this book came out was people throwing around the pinch on light phrase again.
Whoever coined that term needs to be shot. I'm so tired of it.
I can't remember her name. She's a real famous book critic.
Is it Kawakami?
It might be. Anyway, I'll find it and I'll hold on. Now it's in my head, so I gotta. Michiko Kakutani. Cannot talk today. She's the one that coined it. Yeah, for Inherent Vice of all things too. I think that the Pynchon that wrote Gravity's Rainbow is not the same Pynchon that has written Shadow Ticket. It is obvious in the obvious sense, but as a writer, his writing has developed, his ability to present a story, to structure a story, all of that has changed. And I think that's for the better, because I don't want Gravity's Rainbow 9 times. I want new work. I want to see him working in these different areas and playing with different styles. And obviously the hard-boiled noir detective story is not something new to him. But to play in this sandbox so exclusively outside of really Inherent Vice, and you could make the argument that Bleeding Edge was kind of a cyberpunk version of that. This is the most straightforward detective noir story that he's done. And I love it for that. And it's hard for me to pick a favorite scene, I think, at this point. There were a lot of sections that I really enjoyed. Really, I think Will mentioned the meet cute between Hicks and April, and I think that might be one of my favorite just scenes with those two the first time they meet, when we're learning about April as a character and her preferral of married men. It was a real joy to read that section, and there were some other ones that came up. Chapter 34 for me especially was a lot of, especially when I reread it today, was where a lot of things started to click. So I really liked that section. But all in all, like front to back, as far as the writing, I thought it was great. It's breezy. It never feels out of place. It never feels like he's going for something that doesn't work, or that he's trying too hard to reclaim that Gravity's Rainbow Lot 49 sort of vibe with his writing. He's clearly moved into this different part of his life as a writer and has embraced it, and it's working for him.
It's really interesting to me that you specifically outlined kind of his evolution as an author, because I'm struggling not to see this as one of his out of his later oeuvre, see this as one of his most originally Pynchon-y books. Because, like you said, no one wants 10 versions of Gravity's Rainbow.
I think some people do.
I would
Yeah.
like I would like 10 books that are as outrageous as Gravity's Rainbow. But
Sure.
that's an unreasonable expectation. And we got 3 of them anyway, so who cares?
Yeah.
But 5 or 4 if you're being generous. But anyway, I don't know. This feels like it's trying to do the same things that he's been trying to do this whole time, just without the decision to make the experimentation part of the plot, I guess. Because every book up until this one has been like deeply subversive in terms of genre convention and in terms of the whole myth of the heroic cycle kind of thing. And this one, we actually do get a hero who is kind of a good guy. He might not be a hero per se. He's a good guy who's trying to do good things and doesn't get in other people's way. And he's on a traditional quest and he's doing it, and then he gives up because he recognizes that it's a bad idea, not because he can't do it. And that's really the big thing that differentiates this from his other noirs. Like, there was one review that I read earlier today that described Shadow Ticket as a noir made up of nothing but red herrings, as though that's anything new to Pynchon's books. But
yeah,
you could almost just describe his entire bibliography as that.
Yeah. Like at the same time, this is truly just a noir. There is no genre mashing going on here.
No.
And that's a strange thing for him.
I mean, I would maybe argue a little bit just in terms of it's a mixture of literary fiction and detective fiction. I do find the dialogue a lot more original than in a lot of detective novels I've read, or maybe not a lot, but some. Where in at least some detective novels, you kind of get the feeling that the author is like not coming up with it themselves, but that they heard it somewhere, or that they are caught. Like, it's just not. It doesn't always come across as super original. A lot of the dialogue, especially in hard-boiled stuff, it can kind of come across as formulaic at times, depending on the author and the quality of the work. But there are some really great lines in this, like whenever the federal agent at one point says something about like the U.S. government is like calling you to serve it or whatever, and then Hicks is like, "Line's busy." Is a pretty funny line. And just
I did like thinking of the funny lines. The 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea joke got me pretty good.
Yeah. And as for the pacing of the novel, it does have a kind of manic energy, and it's in some ways like kind of weirdly his most, and I found it kind of almost as manic as Gravity's Rainbow, just in terms of its energy, I guess. Where I feel like Against the Day is a little bit more restrained in terms of its, you can kind of dwell on stuff a little bit more. And
measured, I guess, is how I would describe that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as we've talked about it in Against the Day, you could write entire novels from like chapters of Against the Day, and you could do the Shadow Ticket is kind of like y'all were talking about with it being a collection of red herrings. It's kind of a collection of subplots, and by the end of the book, it's a collection of subplots that feature a lot of side characters too. Where you could write, you could write a whole novel centered around, one or two of the bombings from the beginning of the book. You could definitely write a whole novel just about all the cheese stuff. The cheese stuff could have been its own 300-page book at least. Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily had a favorite or least favorite scene. I've already kind of been over how much I love the very, very end, and that might have been my favorite. The first chapter is also quite good. I saw at least one reviewer called it the best chapter of the book. And I'm not sure that I agree, just because I haven't read it a second time. But the first chapter is, there's it gives you a lot of information and really kind of dumps you into this world, like where there's all this lingo. And actually, it's one of the more lingo heavy chapters in the book. Strangely, yeah, I really like the beginning and the end, probably especially. I liked the part about the golem with the machine gun arm. I wish that had been explored more. The stuff about like the perpetual, like not race, but like collective uh driving of motorcycles around like a track, like in Eastern Europe was really cool. I love the parts on the ship where he just kind of it's a lot. The parts where he is on the ship have some similarities to Gravity's Rainbow, where like Slothrop is depicted like climbing aboard the Anubis and stuff, but he like wakes up and there's just a woman in the room. And then Hicks wakes up on the boat. There's a woman in the room. That's kind of like explain where he is and stuff. There are some kind of time jumps or not time. Yeah, I guess time jumps. Some would maybe call them plot holes, where like Hicks arrives in Europe and then is suddenly in Budapest. I think. Where they does kind of jump around a little bit once it gets to Europe, and the timeline becomes a little bit more hard to follow and stuff. As much as I was pretty often confused, I was, always at least interested in where it was going and what was happening. I just, as I've already said, kind of just wanted more from a lot of it.
So I wanted to ask Kate in particular, especially we were talking about the sound of the book. Does he capture an authentic Northern Midwest accent, do you think?
If I have one quibble, no.
Yeah.
I would say that most of the dialogue in this book, which is, in my opinion, the best part. The writing is spectacular across the board, but the dialogue is on another level from a lot of Pynchon's other writing. It does kind of just read as transatlantic as opposed to specifically Midwestern. Yeah, I had expected more sort of not exactly like phonetic spelling of things, but at least some kind of accent marking to either clue in that maybe you should be pronouncing things with an elongated O in particular. For those who are not familiar with like a Wisconsin accent, they pronounce O's really long. So instead of boat, it's like boat, or instead of ghost, it's ghost. That's just one example of what you could do there. But yeah, no, it's funny you mention that, because it does not scan that way to me.
Well, the reason I asked in particular, because I mean, normally I would just assume that I don't know enough about the Northern Midwest speech patterns to catch it or not. But throughout this whole book, I really was trying to find accents for characters and stuff, and it did seem, in a weird way, like this was Pynchon writing in his own voice the whole time, and not at all in a bad sense, because the characters are saying different things in very different ways, but just the actual use of language. And like I wanted to take an opportunity to demonstrate a little bit of that like New York transatlantic thing in conjunction with what Luke was talking about with this as kind of like a collection of side plots. Because like this, okay, so on page 5, I was talking to some pals and they asked what I thought about the new book, and I said, well, let me open to a random page, and I opened up page 5 and I just read this. Hicks has known, at least kept a mental file on, Stuffy Keegan since his early career as a petty offender and eventually MPD snitch who can be bought for a song, which is seldom put on the Ritz. By the standards of these times in this neck of the woods, Stuffy's rap sheet, while technically criminal, is nothing special except for the number of paranoid lapses of judgment, including the one that landed him here to begin with. Out on some otherwise routine run, possibly owing to a lack of sleep, he began to observe in the rearview mirror of growing numbers of law enforcement, which, even if that's what it really was, might not really have been planning to pull Stuffy over, or even notice him at all. But by the time he got to Waukesha, it was too much for his nerves. So he found a telephone and called the police and asked them to just please come and get it over with. And it's that First of all, insane use of cadence and rhyme in
Yeah.
prose.
Yep.
Like, just my brain will just keep reading this whole book looking for the next rhyme, and it will not be disappointed once. But it also, yeah, like all of the characters, I kept coming back to this New York kind of up the
Yeah.
nose pronunciation. And that's odd because he usually is dedicated to accents.
Yeah, agreed. And I like, and I'm okay with it because I like the end result. Like the end result is kind of magical in a way. It's funny you pick that section because that's actually one of my favorite like early moments. Also, not to be that guy, but it's Waukesha, not Waukesha.
Well, you see, but would a New Yorker pronounce it that way?
Probably. But yeah, like if you were to read that same paragraph trying to force a Midwestern accent into it, it would completely like slow down and change entirely. Hicks has known, at least kept a mental file on Stuffy Keegan since his early career as a petty offender and eventually MPD snitch who can be bought for a song. Like it does not read, the same. But it is, I'm glad that you brought that up because it is certainly a difference. I am, however, with the pronunciation of Waukesha, reminded of how funny it was for me to come across all the different, primarily indigenous words that a lot of our towns or like landmarks or rivers are named after, and just imagining how people are pronouncing them because I do understand that a lot of these places sound really strange if you just look at the word and are unfamiliar. As far as favorite or least favorite scenes, definitely the description of Stuffy Keegan getting so paranoid that he calls the police on himself is up there. That's such a great moment in the book. One of the enduring images of the book for me, or individual scenes of the book for me, is when Hicks opens his envelope and sees that he's got a ticket for a steamship, and he tries calling Boint.
Oh God,
and
yeah.
Boint pretends to be like going into a tunnel, so to speak, where he's making sounds as if the line is cracking up, and then Pynchon just writes this list of like he tries and he gets a completely different person. He tries and there's no answer. He like everything that could possibly go wrong with a phone happens to him, and then eventually the payphone just stops accepting coins.
Yeah.
That's that is absolutely one of my favorite.
That and the weight machines that tell him he needs to lose weight.
Yeah.
Needs to lose weight.
Those are great. I enjoyed the fact that there's not one, but I think 4 references to magenta and green in this book.
I think it's at least 4, yeah.
Yeah, and there's one where he used slightly more highfalutin words for the same matching of color shades. Like I think he said like burgundy and something else or something like that. To still just do magenta and green. That was a great thing to see again. I did also enjoy some of those individual vignettes of like side characters, meeting each other. Particularly like some of the Hop Wingdale stuff I really enjoyed a lot, the scenes that he's in. And the moment in which, oh man, I can't remember his name. Bruno Airmont's like number 2 who rides a panhead. Or a flathead. The scene where he accidentally drives off like the motorcycle course, and the way that Pynchon describes how he ends up surrounded by this gang of fascists is another moment from particularly later in the book that I loved the way that it was written. And the whole sequence where we get the flashback with how Hicks rescued Daphne was great. I loved that whole sequence. And then a lot of the stuff with Skeet I really like too in the beginning, like him trying to melt a bowling ball in the oven. It's just there's plenty of humor and plenty of individual moments and scenes in this book that I really really enjoyed. Cody, in the notes here, you say that you specifically have some thoughts on chapter 34 and on, so I want to give you space for those thoughts.
So, as I mentioned, when I was rereading it this morning, I want to say chapter 34 is where I had started this morning, and just a lot clicked in those sections. I think this is where it really starts to drive home what the whole book is kind of getting at. The sort of lost feeling that a lot of people have, and I think us as readers, like we mentioned with Hicks not being around as much, and that kind of feeling of losing him as a character. There's some absolutely fantastic lines that are in here. I don't want to. I mean, I could go on and on about this section, but there's right at the bottom of page 257, the first page of chapter 34. Now and then she thinks she sees familiar faces, swing kids aged into the hopeless awareness that what may have been possible for them once is no longer so. Girls who used to dance with their braids all loose before the end of the first set are now en route to children, church, and kitchen. No greetings of swing Heil anymore, not even in a whisper. No more gathering up closer to the bandstand to listen, humming harmonies, sometimes just to hold each other in what they call sway in time to the music. This is kind of the section where I started, all of the pieces of this started to kind of put themselves together, and the characters start to kind of realize that the way things are going in the world in which they inhabit, because it's, obviously this is a different, view of a different America, a different world, as all of his books are kind of situated in. And so you have these characters kind of starting to realize, like, okay, these signs. I think this is the most explicit instance in which Pynchon has shown us these characters in his book that are realizing that their lack of attention or their lack of care for what's going on is starting to catch up with them, and that disaster is imminent, and that there's really nothing they can do. So it's I'm kind of at a loss of how to explain this. I should have taken better notes about how I wanted to go about talking about this, but it's I would implore anyone who is on a second read, if you haven't already finished it, like really slow down starting with chapter 34, and really be sure to take your time with it, just because there is so much that starts to come together. A lot of the plot threads kind of start to tie themselves together. Yeah, I could go on and on and on, but I don't want to kind of influence anybody's reread of this. I'm kind of curious to see when you guys finish it for the second time, if you come away with the same sort of feeling that I've had with this. But yeah, this is definitely where everything kind of starts just to kind of the circle closes, so to speak. So yeah, this is, I think, just the best part of the book for me was those last like 50 pages or whatever it is.
I won't say I agree entirely in terms of like them being my favorite parts of the book, but I will say that only having read it once, I incidentally took your advice in advance by just essentially just slowing my pace reading the book by about half every day, which meant that those last few chapters I really mulled them over. And I don't disagree at all. I do think there is something about those last few chapters that if you take your time, a lot more things start to connect. I'd also, since we brought up the color stuff, I didn't take meticulous notes on the lime green and magenta, because I honestly, I trusted everyone else at some point to do that.
You knew that's what we were looking for.
Not just y'all, but the world at large.
Yeah.
Something far more perplexing to me, in concert with the lime and magenta, on page 133 and then page 63, you have references to, on 63, deep violet and blood orange, and on 133 you have indigo and neon orange, I want to say.
Oh yeah,
Are you
midnight
referring to midnight-
aubergine and
yeah.
electric kumquat.
Thank you. Yep, aubergine and electric kumquat. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's no difference between the words I used in those. But those are the colors on the cover, and that makes
Yeah.
me feel like it was
Oh, that's true.
weighty. And I've done a lot of numerological divination and found nothing. Just in terms of trying to factor those numbers and add up digits and all that. No luck. But those two being on 63, which is just about at the 20% mark, just over it, and then 155 is like almost dead center. Feels like there's meaning, or as the last few pages advise, maybe not. Maybe there is no meaning.
I mean, if you really want to get conspiracy corner with it, if you combine those two colors together, you get reddish brown, and Hitler's uniforms for the brown shirts were reddish brown. Like if you really want to go down that route.
Well, and that's the thing is the magenta and lime green are complementary colors, and
Right.
you combine two complementary colors, you get brown. But those are not complementary. That like electric blue and violet, or the electric purple and blood orange, or electric kumquat are not complementary at all.
Yeah, it's a good point. I didn't connect that with the cover art.
Neither.
That's interesting. Do we have any favorite characters?
I think Hicks is probably the universal favorite. Yeah, he's one of my favorite penchant protagonists, I think, for sure.
He's so good. And I feel like
really
he's really, him and Maxine Tarnow, I feel like are the two that really stand out to me as being particularly well developed.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too that they're also probably the most genuinely pure-hearted. I mean, you could maybe make the argument for Zoid, but Zoid's also not really the most attentive father, so he kind of loses some points there. But Maxine and Hicks are both like genuinely, they're just good people. They want to do the right thing. I think it was Will and Luke that mentioned that earlier. Like, want to do the right thing for the right reasons, despite the obstacles that they're coming up against. And it really, we don't have many, if any, other protagonists like that are the center focus of his stories.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're underrating Doc Sportello's intentions.
That's fair. That's fair. At the end of the day, he does the thing that does bother him is little kid blues.
Some of my favorites were Daphne.
Oh yeah, Daphne.
Daphne is great.
Yeah, she's really well written. Her dialogue is particularly interesting, I found. All this stuff about the Al Capone of cheese. That joke never got old, and there are a lot of jokes in the book related to it, where it's just kind of like branching out of, and the whole thing with, he introduces himself to Al Capone as the Al Capone of cheese.
What are you, the Al Capone of?
Yeah, it's really funny. Well, those are two characters that I always really liked being around and stuff. I did like her boyfriend. Is it Hop, right?
Yeah, Hop
Wingdale,
the jazz musician.
Yeah,
he also seemed really interesting to me. I did like the part where he's like supposed to be, like he's supposed to not play the clarinet in front of either Nazis or proto-Nazis. And like he's just supposed to downplay the fact that he's a Jewish jazz musician in front of a bunch of Nazis, and then that same group of Nazis is supposedly looking for him. I like that little subplot a lot, and it reminded me of Green Room a little bit.
True, yeah.
Yeah, and I did like Lou Bassnight, his reappearance. It did feel a little bit like intentionally anticlimactic in that Lou didn't really have any like real answers for Hicks a lot of the time, or not maybe real answers, but any real solutions to Hicks's problems. Where it seemed like Lou Bassnight could relate, perhaps, but he kind of had his own issues he was dealing with in some ways. And yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I've actually kind of been thinking about how like intentionally anticlimactic Pynchon can be at times. Especially in Vineland, I think, because I've been thinking about Vineland more with One Battle After Another just having come out. But then this book is I didn't find it anticlimactic at all. I did like that he kind of breaks the fourth wall a little bit at the end. And I also, like I already said, the letter at the end, switching to a first person ending was a very interesting thing where, Skeet, I don't really actually truthfully remember that much about him from my first read, where he wasn't a character I initially focused on. But that last letter, like the tone of it was really, and just the way it's written was really good. So it made me like want to, look out for that character more on my second and future reads.
Yeah, he's great. The lack of answers that Lou gives, especially the second time that he goes and talks to him, but like specifically kind of what's going on, what happens to me, what's happening to me, and he just drops into this like it's like all of a sudden he becomes like a precog or something, where he just starts saying this monologue of like death and destruction that's coming to Europe or whatever. Just until eventually Hicks just kind of walks away. Like, I'm not getting anything out of this. Was one of my favorite moments. But it's all right. Go ahead, Cody.
I was just going to say that I think the inclusion of Lou is a really interesting one, and this is where I'm kind of like, man, I'm very tempted to jump ahead and just like finish Against the Day ahead of the show. Just because I have some theories that I want to know if I'm right on, as far as things that happen in Against the Day and how they connect to things in this book. I think there's a lot more going on that might make this a more direct connection than it seems on the surface. Especially Lou's inclusion. I'm curious how his timeline in this book is related to the happenings in Against the Day that precede his appearance in that, if that makes sense. Like what caused his wife to leave him, and is this the same wife that left him that we're hearing about in this, or did he get remarried and something happened? You know what I mean? Like there's a lot that I'm trying to piece together in my head with him, but I was glad to see him in there, and it never felt shoehorned. It never felt like it was like, oh, look, we're having fun, we're putting an old character that everyone likes back in the story. Like he felt like he belonged there, and it served a purpose, albeit a limited one, because of his inability to really do anything. But I think that plays to his character. I think by that point, he would just be kind of, burned out and like, oh, I don't know, I can't. What do you want me to do? Like, so yeah, I'm happy that he was in there, and I think that it's going to lend a lot to it. And again, I think time will be kinder to this book than people are being to it now.
Yeah, I think that on it. Okay, to answer the Lou Bass Night thing, you don't think that it felt a little winky the way that Thessaly was like, you should go down and talk to Lou Bass Night, and then the chapter just ends.
Yeah, I think it did, but I think it was a very tongue in cheek kind of wink. A very to audio, to make audio of a GIF. It's very much Lucille Bluth winking. Yeah,
that's fair. But I also agree with you on what you're saying about, I think time is going to be more kind to this novel than it is currently, because I think that unfortunately there is this sense that this is his last book, right? Because the man's 88. Like, who are we kidding? And I think a lot of people were hoping that it was going to be something more.
I think they want another doorstop.
Yeah, I want another doorstop or something more kaleidoscopic or something far more panoramic than this is in regards to what it covers. And instead, that is decidedly not what it is. But in my mind, what it really is it's Pynchon being as true to himself as he possibly could be. In that he's been writing, as we've mentioned a couple times over the course of this episode, these little noir stories full of red herrings and doors that open to brick walls. And if this is his last book, and I say if, because there are now rumors that he's completed another one alongside this one, whether those have any amount of validity to it or not remains to be seen. But if this is his last book, I think it's fitting that he chose to do that only more so, in the sense that, like, this is such a specifically noir book. It is in the 30s when this genre like gained popularity and ubiquity. It is written in a transatlantic tone of voice from beginning to end, which is how those novels were written and later film adaptations were delivered by the actors. It is him doing what he clearly loves more than anything else to its furthest conclusion that he has done. But he also does it in concert with what his sort of greater writing project is about, in the sense that it still occupies an important space in time of social change or economic change or political change or all three that he hasn't written about, and does have bigger things on its mind, like the development of fascism and the ways in which people in the face of that kind of hide or change their stripes, so to speak, and how the systems that govern all of these changes often don't make sense, often come to power in ways that feel almost like a comedy of errors, especially if you study like Mussolini's rise to power, and how it does reshape the world into something that you often don't recognize. He's still doing all of that, but he's doing it through a way that feels very true to himself. And I think that if there is no other book, if this is the last one, it is a fitting way for him to finish his writing career, because of the fact that it does just feel so thoroughly like something that he himself would be interested in reading, or that he himself would be particularly interested in writing. And I think that is maybe what is missing from a lot of those reviews, or the kind of, not necessarily backlash, but criticism of the book that has been present in a lot. That a lot of people were expecting, like, oh, he's writing a book about the rise of fascism in a time when fascism is rising currently. Pretty prescient, but he's also an 88-year-old man. And he has given us enough over the course of the last, 50 years, that for him to just sort of do one for him, so to speak, makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that that's not going to be totally appreciated until, some time has passed.
Yeah. No, it's very much, I was thinking about this today. This is very much a sort of rehash of the reviews and the initial reception to Vineland, because there's a super long, this is the second longest gap in his bibliography, the first being 1973 to 1990, and everybody was clamoring online when we found out about this coming out. The online discourse was immediately, this is going to be such an amazing book, and it's going to be, everyone wanted the doorstopper, everyone wanted the Civil War story that might happen, everyone wanted this or that or this. And I think that is part of what I don't like about this, the age in which we live, is that online discourse that exists. People review things before they're out, and that happened with this book. It happens with everything. It is astonishing. People will give things star ratings when they have not been released yet. But more so, I made it a point several years ago. I had to just stop reading reviews of things, whether it's music or film or books, because it will inevitably cloud the way I take that media in afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
After I finish it, I can read a review if I want, but I kind of just stopped caring, because the person who wrote that review, their experience is not my experience. But if I read their experience beforehand, I'm going to have those things on my mind when I read it, and it's going to kind of shape how I take it. So I've made it very clear to myself that I was going to stay away from all the reviews before the book came out, and I wouldn't look at anything until I had finished it at least once. And going through the sort of general discourse that exists both critically and online, it's been kind of disappointing to see people. I don't want to sit here and say people can't be disappointed by it. That's absolutely fair. You can not have enjoyed the book, but I don't think it's fair to say you didn't enjoy it because it wasn't X, Y, or Z. that's where it's kind of, crossing that line between a fair review and critiquing something that it, on merits and grounds that it never tried to be existing on. I think one of their critical reviews, I think, trying to remember what they said. They basically, I think they referred to it as like the least notable book he had written or something like that. And I don't know. It's such a I'm trying to think of the word. I guess it's hard to really fully, especially with an artist like this, an author like this. It's really, really difficult to fully grasp the overall success of something on one go through with it. I think you can come away with a cursory experience and say, yeah, I liked it, I didn't like it, here's what I liked, here's what I didn't like it. But to make an authoritative declaration in writing of, this is the worst thing he's ever done, because 10 years from now you could come back to this book. People said that about Vineland. I said that about Bleeding Edge, that it was, one of my less favorite of his books, and this and that and the other, and a lot of that I think was clouded by other people's reviews of it. I went back when we reread it for the show. I love it. And it, time changes how we perceive things so much. And I think that that's definitely what's going to be the case here. I think a lot of people are just initially disappointed because it wasn't whatever they had built it in their head to be before it came out. And that's what we have to remember, is that we can't do that. We live in an age where it's easier to do that because there's a lot more access to things that we didn't have access to before. But to anticipate something and expect it to be what you want it to be and then be disappointed that it's not is just stupid. And I hate that we've come to that point, but that is kind of where we are.
If y'all will indulge me a little bit of rambling, I have two historical author examples that I don't think will shock anyone, but I think are very relevant to exactly what y'all are saying. So let's jump back to Thomas Pynchon's earlier work and look at Gravity's Rainbow. Now, if you ask me, there are two books that go into that book to produce it. It's Ulysses and it's Moby-Dick. Those are books that were written by authors who were both immensely popular earlier in their careers. And there was a 17-year gap after James Joyce released Ulysses, and there was a significant gap after Herman Melville published Moby-Dick. There were gaps for different reasons. Following the gap after Gravity's Rainbow, pretty much everyone expected Pynchon's next novel to be his Finnegan's Wake. And it wasn't that. It was kind of the opposite. And after publishing Moby-Dick, Herman Melville basically swore off writing sea novels. And then spent the rest of his career writing weird, bizarro short stories and short novels that people to this day cannot agree whether they are piles of crap or his best work ever. And I think something that people need to get through their heads is that he didn't release Finnegan's Wake. He released Vineland. He released something that is small and traditional, and if rumors are to be understood, was meant to be something that you could teach in a college classroom without straining a teacher too much. Pynchon clearly, when he was a young man, felt like he had to write absurdly ambitious novels.
Mm-hmm.
But like Melville, and to bring in a third example, like Tolstoy to some extent, he clearly doesn't think that that's like what book writing is. He clearly doesn't think that book writing is this operation where you mash together, philosophy and fiction and his history and, essentially try and brainwash the people reading it. He clearly thinks that fiction as against the day makes extremely clear. And this book kind of by inverse makes extremely clear. Fiction is for imagining things and finding better ways to be and to understand yourself better through a lens. And this insistence that because something isn't as X, Y, or Z as something the same artist has made before, it is therefore bad, is the epitome of entitlement. And it's so infuriating.
Yeah.
Because no, Thomas Pynchon wanted to write books that didn't have lazy stories because he grew up in the 40s and 50s, and up until the 30s there was a ton of censorship in literature. And up until the 60s there was a ton of, not necessarily censorship, but a lot of policing around what kids were able to access. And this idea that, like, oh, he's not writing something that is outrageous. He's not writing something that is experimental. He's not writing something that is, gonna get him banned. No, he wrote a book, and it's a good book.
Yeah.
Just
if I could take that monologue and put it on a T-shirt, I would wear that T-shirt very often, just front and back.
Yeah. Well, I knew we were in for something of a bizarre experience when the main focus of online discussion of the book before it came out was the fucking page count.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh my God, it's not going to be 1,000 pages. Oh my God, it's only 300 pages. Like, who genuinely The Crying of Lot 49 is like 160 pages, depending on the edition of it that you have. And that is a phenomenal story. It doesn't matter if it's not, this 1,000-page opus, that's, again, this is what I'm talking about. This is where, like Will said, it's that entitlement. Like, we have to understand that we cannot expect artists to do the art we want to do. If you want that, go make the art, do that. That's where the inspiration should come. Like, you want 1,000-page experimental novel about the Civil War and restructuring and all. Fantastic. Go write it. That's, if the world needs it, then the world will embrace it when you put it out there. But don't tell authors, don't expect authors behind their backs to produce the art that you want them to produce. That is just, we cannot do that.
Every novel since Gravity's Rainbow that Pynchon has written has received like mixed to somewhat negative like reviews. I mean, I know that Against the Day was not super super highly rated whenever it came out by critics online and in print. Inherent Vice, as we've already been over, that's when Pynchon Light was invented, and Bleeding Edge to this day is not viewed as to be a contender for one of Pynchon's best novels by most, I would say. And I do think that Shadow Ticket, I enjoyed it more than some other Pynchon novels, as I've already said. And there are some, I think I saw at least one reviewer said that it was his favorite Pynchon novel, or was the best that he thought that it was the best Pynchon novel. So that, it's always going to be a mixed bag from critics a lot of the time. I haven't paid a lot of attention to like I don't know if it's called non-official, just like Reddit stuff about Shadow Ticket. I haven't really seen people talking about it positively or negatively, just because I haven't searched it out. I already said a while ago, but I do find it pretty timely. I think people that are calling it not timely have never hung out with groups of conservatives before.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
I have largely unintentionally, just because I was a friend of a friend and stuff like that. Not in terms of like like actual, just like like hanging out in the South. Sometimes you find yourself in situations where people are more conservative than you thought they might be. I would say that I've met people that in the 30s would have been exactly like Uncle Lefty. His like, and he has some kind of funny lines. The whole "Der Führer is their future."
Mhm.
kind of pun type thing is a really memorable line from this novel, as is the we're National Socialists or socializing is another very memorable line. One review that really annoyed me mentioned that at the end of the review that the person thought that Pynchon should have addressed let's say, I mean, like basically just the everything that's happening in Gaza and stuff. And I do think that quote that Cody read out does kind of address that, does kind of address things that are going on with ICE, with like people disappearing and stuff. I mean, there are people disappearing in this book at times. And we've already talked about how timely it is in some different ways, but I do think it is a lot more timely than people are giving it credit for, and about as timely as a novel can be that's set in 1932 and 1933. You know, we're like literally. I mean, that the mention of Gaza in that review, like, what does he expect Pynchon to do? Like, like write "Free Palestine" or something in the margins or something.
That's where it
You
feels like
know,
people are just trying to use their platform to kind of push their own agenda about something.
yeah.
It's
And
real shitty.
he mentioned stuff about how like so many Pynchon's fans wanted Pynchon to write like an autobiography, supposedly, and it's like, I mean, I have seen that sentiment some, but it's not like some like online movement. It's not like the Snyder Cut, like people are like tweeting and like congregating around this dumb idea of what they think some movie or piece of art should be,
Mhm.
or that they're expecting it to come out or something. It was a weird review that came up kind of annoyingly soon whenever you Google Shadow Ticket review. Where like I found some reviews below it and was sent some reviews that I actually really enjoyed. Yeah, I mean, I actually really enjoyed reading the reviews after reading it for the first time, just because of like it's a wide spectrum of opinions, and a lot of times what people will focus on in reviews will later come up a lot in scholarship about the work. Which I've recently been reading some scholarship about Against the Day, and a lot of the essays are about completely different things, but would still return to a kind of limited number of scenes and characters and stuff for the most part. That and a lot of them seem to be citing initial reactions to the novel as well. Um, and I do want to kind of reiterate that I do think this novel will age better than people seem to think it will.
I guess kind of building off of that aspect of what you've mentioned, Luke, do we have anything else that we want to talk specifically about the themes of the book? Obviously, this book has a lot on its mind as it relates to the rise of fascism, the way that cultures kind of reshape themselves around it, and then as well as this sort of repeated theme in a lot of Pynchon's work of fate, decision making, how much control we really have over our lives or the directions that we're headed in. Um, I for one thought that the messaging of this book was pretty clear. I think that some of that's purposeful because of the time that it's being published in, but also just from the perspective of when you're kind of hinging on that that edge of the canyon, and you're kind of about to dive deep into the abyss of something long and cruel and horrible. You can kind of feel it in the air, and that certainly does permeate this book. And there are a number of really good asides in it. I don't remember who had mentioned at this point, but the whole klezmer aside, Luke had mentioned this. The whole klezmer music aside, when Hop is specifically being instructed to tone down his Jewishness, even down to the music that he's playing. There's this aside, I think it's from Daphne, where she talks about this kind of revelation that she didn't even realize that what the music her boyfriend and his band was playing could be politically charged in any way, that like that music was in and of itself representative of a culture and a people group, and she is watching that pass away essentially, or at least be hidden. There are a number of moments akin to that especially later in the book, that are excellent. And I think that there's something interesting in the way in which this book contrasts the European section with things like Hop's story and several other aspects of what's going on in Hungary, to the way in which it's just sort of ignored in America, is the kind of best way that I can put how it feels. Like, people are aware of what's going on, but it's not talked about. There's this Nazi group meeting at a bowling alley, but they're just kind of left alone, and how that silence does not necessarily indicate an acceptance, but rather that the alternative of fighting back against it is so difficult and so scary that it is easier to just not engage. And of course, that is somewhat representative of America's attitudes about World War II before it, deliberately entered it, and somewhat about World War One. But I think it also has to do with the fact that a lot of people in this book aren't even aware of where that's coming from the American side, like where the influence of these political changes or machinations are originating. In that, like, we never get a sense of who's running Unamalgamated Ops. We never get a sense of who's sending Hicks to Europe. We never get a sense of any of that, which is purposeful for a number of reasons. But then also, when you take it down to the individual level of Hicks, he is kind of unaware that he was a fascist, and until someone really points it out to him, and how that is often the result of that kind of ignoring and that kind of slow, gradual acceptance of a situation being what it is, as opposed to trying to intervene or trying to actively resist something. I think a lot of that is really, really well done, particularly Hicks's own realization about who he was prior to becoming a detective with Unamalgamated. So yeah, there's a lot to discuss there. So I want to just kind of give an opportunity for any of you guys to share thoughts you may have, or something that you want to mention.
We have in the notes that there's two versions of America / reality alluded to at the end. I do find it interesting that this novel, it features Lou Bassnight from Against the Day, but it doesn't feature any direct characters from Gravity's Rainbow that I can think of. And I think one thing that's easy to forget in this novel is that General MacArthur leads a military coup and takes over from FDR at one point.
Yeah, it breaks up the bonus army.
Yeah, and FDR is a big somebody that Slothrop really looks up to in Gravity's Rainbow, where it's repeatedly stated that he really loved FDR. So as much as I like to, and other people enjoy online and in reviews and different stuff, like to talk about how interconnected Pincher's novels can be, it is kind of subverted a little bit. One thing that we haven't talked about porting or asporting yet, and one thing that it made me think of a lot is, and this is kind of subverted at one point, but it made me think of, it's set in 1932 and 1933, I think, which would have been before the Holocaust started. I think I could be wrong about that. It's been a while since I really could give you solid dates on when people started disappearing and when their stuff started disappearing. Quote disappearing, end quote. I mean, from an outsider's perspective and a non-historical perspective, like a local's perspective, they would have just disappeared. And yeah, I found that very interesting to think about. And it is, like I said, subverted because it is mentioned that Jewish people's belongings are disappearing. But yeah, that was the thing that I it's not really, I don't know if it's really there or intentional, but that's what it made me think of.
You might be right. I think it was 1933 that they started doing the slow roll of the Holocaust by imprisoning disabled people and socialists and stuff.
I do love the theory that whenever Hicks is trying to hit the Bolshevik or whatever with his sap, that it just supposedly apported somewhere else and then asported back, or I may maybe getting those in reverse, but I found that section like very kind of memorable and hallucinatory, like of him like swinging the sap and then it just disappears and then it reappears in his hand like later.
Yeah.
I found that section is really well done. It's a little bit like it's lingered on a little bit more than some other flashbacks and stuff, and it defines the character in a different way than other flashbacks do in this novel, and I found all of that really well done.
Yeah, especially the way that it makes him realize that he was ready to kill somebody, right? And that causes a moment of reflection for him. I think is particularly great about what Pynchon is doing there. It would be easy enough to write that scene and just kind of move on and just have that be sort of a moment for a character to kind of take a beat to think about what they're doing in general, but it's specifically that idea that Hicks recognizes in himself at that moment an impulse to kill, and that frightens him, and it is reincorporated in a very clever way when he's in Hungary, and he is given an opportunity to kill the guy who rides around the Harley, whose name I still can't remember, and he is wondering if he's finally going to have to kind of punch that particular ticket that he had been saved from it up until this moment. But
was it Ace?
This guy might shoot him.
Is that who you're thinking of? Is it Ace?
Yeah, it's something that with an A. I
think it's Ace. Yeah, that name just popped into my head. Yeah, no, and I want to real quick jump back to what Luke mentioned, the two versions of America and reality that I had in the notes here, and I wanted to highlight specifically at the end of chapter 35, there's a scene that I think really hammers home what I was talking about earlier with how a lot of this stuff at the end of the book really starts to bring everything together. And this is where a lot of that comes into play. So starting at the very bottom of 268 to the end of the chapter here, this is the scene where Hicks and Daphne are parting. What one of them should have been saying was, "We're in the last minutes of a break that will seem so wonderful and peaceable and carefree. If anybody's around to remember, still trying to keep on with it before it gets too dark, until finally we turn to look back the way we came, and there's that last light bulb, once so bright, now feebly flickering, about to burn out, and it's well past time to be saying, Forsheims, let's ambulate. Stay or go. Two fates beginning to diverge. Back to the U.S., marry, raise a family, assemble a life you can persuade yourself is free from fear, as meanwhile over here, the other outcome continues to unfold, to roll in dark as the end of time. Those you could have saved could have shifted at least somehow onto a safer stretch of track, or one by one robbed, beaten, killed, seized, and taken away into the nameless, the unrecoverable. Until one night, too late, you wake into an understanding of what you should have been doing with your life all along. Something like that. If anybody was still there to hear it, which there isn't. I think what's really especially interesting about that, aside from the obvious of, this is that moment of divergence where things can go one way or the other. This is clearly this is Pynchon talking to the audience. This isn't Daphne. This isn't Hicks saying this is what I should have said. This is the narrator of the story telling us this is what they should have said. And I remember reading that section this morning and then stopping and rereading it like 2 or 3 times just to really take it in. And then there's that scene a little bit later that kind of builds up on this one last time where Bruno's talking about like, where are you guys taking me? And they're like, well, to America, kinda, but not really. So I thought this is where it all starts to that point of divergence, right after. And I think this is what Against the Day is setting up. And again, this is part of why I want to go back and finish it sooner than later so I can see if I'm right about this. I think this is that split. This is that point in time where things finally, it's hinted at in Mason and Dixon. It's starting to bubble up more and Against the Day with this unknown sort of global Lovecraftian element of horror that is existing and that schism between the two timelines that exist. And this is where it is. As they say, to Bruno. It's the U.S., but not exactly the one you left. There's exile and there's exile.
That passage that you read out, that was one of the standout passages from this novel for me, and I just want to point out how sad it is.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a very melancholic notion that he kind of explores there.
Yeah,
especially after the sort of optimism that ended Bleeding Edge. That scene of Maxine walking her kids to school and turning around to walk away, and that feeling of like, yeah, everything could be okay, but now here we are,
Ugh.
So
why'd you have to say that?
somebody had to, right?
Well, so I'd like to accent Cody's reading of that Two Fates passage by pointing out that it's a lot of, I mean, I'm going to call it thematic. I think that's underplaying it a bit. There's a lot of inherent vice in that, because, and this is something that's come up time and time again across Pynchon's books. Just that kind of dissolution of the childish idea of there are good people and there are bad people, and then the slightly less childish idea that there are conservatives and there are progressives. That he, with this book, seems to be kind of tying it up with the idea that no, there's looking at things in their face and there's not. There's being honest with the world, or being honest with yourself about the world that's around you, and there's just making puns on National Socialism and eating bratwurst. Like you can do one or you can do the other, and they are mutually exclusive. You can be progressive and hurt people. You can be conservative and help people. You can be a rotten person who's really nice to someone who needs it in the moment, or you can be an amazing person who bites someone's head off. But what really matters in a historical context is, whether or not you want to persuade yourself your life is free from fear, whether or not you want to watch people disappear and feel that pain and recognize in hindsight what you could have done. And there's no benefit to it for you as a person. It's just what you're supposed to do for the rest of us. And that kind of like spirals, that's kind of spiraled me into what my favorite kind of theme of Pynchon's is kind of encapsulated with with Bruno, especially with his line, "They're trying to take away everything that I'm the Al Capone of." Where, like, in this book, you do see that full-on what happens in Gravity's Rainbow and in Lot 49 and in all of the books that take place after World War II. You have that kind of insistence that people have to live up to an idealized version of themselves that they borrowed from popular culture. And that is what seems like people can't look away from anymore. And I think that when it comes to like what is timely about this novel, looking around at people my age, I think that is the message that people do need more than anything. And it sounds like trite Gen X nihilist shit, but I mean, for real, there is a degree to which, especially with social media these days, that people who are not, over 30 with an established career or set of relationships that make their life feel whole, seem to be obsessed with this idea of creating an identity for themselves that fits into other people's ideals and worldviews. Yeah. And this book is so much about kind of the value of recognizing that life goes on, even if everything that you are Al Capone of has been taken away.
Yeah, that life goes on, but also that your actions do have an effect on other people in that you can positively affect other people's circumstances. Like, I'm thinking particularly that within what you had just said, how so much of this book, when you get down to it, is relationships that are not working out, or that are characters that are in trouble from something, and somebody else comes along to help them out of the situation that they are in. And I think that is also an incredibly poignant aspect, not just within the inherent vice sort of comparison, but something that runs through so much of his material. That idea that it is these small acts done by individual people towards other people around them or to their broader community that ends up being able to kind of help tip these cosmic scales. I make a reference to the ending of Vineland all the time because he spells it out on the page there, but particularly the way in which this book is a series of side plots, as Luke put it, or a series of side characters all having impacts on one another, ultimately to try and improve their situation. There's a real message there that I think is also missing, because there is an inherent kind of weird push and pull of people, yes, wanting to have an established identity of something, but that is also accepted by like a broader sort of societal definition or something, not just within themselves. But that doesn't always necessarily come with action in any way, at least not that I have seen. And I think it's poignant that Pynchon pushes that a bit in the second half of the book here. Well, do we have any other thoughts on themes that we want to talk about? Or I was going to offer, if anyone has like particular quotes they want to share, we could do that as well.
I think I've done the quotes that I wanted to bring up. So if anybody else has any,
I do have two. One comes from earlier in the book, after the kind of table setting of Hicks is mostly wrapped up, from a perspective of who he used to be and how he ended up working out at Unamalgamated. There's this really great quote on page 36, where it says, "But something must have been filtering through anyway. Hicks was slowly becoming aware at this time of what you could call a change in outlook, finding himself mysteriously in and out of the toy building down on 2nd Street or Nanking, a new South Side joint, places that specialized in chop suey and dancing. Not his usual idea of a Saturday night. And another unexpected weekend in Chicago actually required to mediate, without understanding a word of Chinese, between Un Liang's and Hip Sing's regarding their uneasy arrangements about who's supposed to get the..." I'm reading the wrong quote. Jesus. So this quote comes from page 36, where it says, "Maybe not as solid a voice as Dick Powell, not bad as a hoofer, yet as if in his sleep he has somehow aged from a bright-eyed juvenile song and dance artist into a street-hardened, less often shaved and brilliantine specimen. One that the most level-headed of starlets these days might have trouble keeping still for even a couple bars of being crooned to by. Hicks finds himself ambling along the old worn pathways that led into whatever the label civilian is currently being used for. A nationwide consensus including house chores on weekends, a dutiful ear to the radio, a disinclination to pick up any lengthier of a rap sheet than he's already got. Even all day on into overtime and half the night on his feet and in motion, Hicks has begun to feel a kind of spiritual heavysetness sneaking up on him. Sometimes he'll go a week without hearing a gunshot. Even desperate enough between shifts to go into the office and listen to the police traffic on the thrill box. Who wouldn't start to get nostalgic for the high-adventure escapades of earlier Prohibition days?" I love this quote as a description of Hicks becoming who he is. And it comes as kind of a culmination of all of these stories from sort of previously told elements of his life, or previously lived elements of his life. It is this beautiful culmination of several pages of backstory where, I don't know, there was something so effective in the imagery used and the way that Pynchon describes him as like, suddenly he has found himself aged into this, where just as if like he woke up one day and realized that he is actually very different than the person that he was going to be, and that he thought he was probably on his way towards being. It's really good, and to use that as a descriptor of a character in comparison to kind of the national identity of what a civilian is brilliantly reincorporated in. I think it was you, Cody, who read this quote out. The idea of like women disappearing into kitchens and like the changes that are happening at a societal level that indicate a bend towards conservatism, right? Like the images that are being given are not that different from one another, but one is explicitly being illustrated as fascist when he's in Europe, and the other is not. It's really, really good stuff, and it was a moment that like stopped me in my tracks when I was reading it, and I have these moments a lot with Pynchon where it's just like, like fuck you for being this good at writing, like that's just annoying. And that this was definitely one of those. The other quote that I have is the beginning of chapter 28, where it says, "Sometimes all Hicks wants is to be back in Milwaukee, restored to normal life, to a country not yet gone fascist, a place of clarity and safety, still snoozy and safe, brought smoke from a lunch wagon grill, some kid practicing accordion through an open window, first snow coming into town off the prairie, bar rooms where the smell of beer is generations deep, women in round little hats, penny scales, newsstands run by war veterans named Sarge, everyday street doors that lead to nothing deeper than friendly speakeasies, El Productos in glass tubes, fried perch and coleslaw on Friday nights, buttermilk curlers, goes without saying. A fantasy of old-time Milwaukee, dairy-colored surfaces through the leisurely days, imperceptibly continuing to darken behind the bituminous haze, safe to breathe, never as bad as Chicago. Back when you spent more time on the interurban than in a car. Work just unexciting enough to keep a gumshoe happy. Matrimonials with little to worry about except now and then some dainty pearl-handled housewife special in a kitchen cabinet someplace." It's great. It's great. There's not much else that I can say beyond. Other than that, again, more great Milwaukee and Wisconsin stuff. Maybe you don't hear as many accordions being played out of windows. But still, a lot of those descriptors of what it's like to live here are still pretty accurate. And it was a case where like I know that feeling that he's writing about, that like that yearning for familiarity and yearning for home and these specific kind of sense memories of it is just so well rendered there. And I imagine that part of it is because it's a place that I'm familiar with, but the truth inherent to it is universal.
Yeah, unfortunately for me, like the way that I engaged with this book really did not lend itself to picking out quotes. Because honestly, I keep opening just random pages and finding things that I like more than the last thing I picked up. Yeah, like I'm glad Kate chose to read out that last one, because I think that's an important one to highlight. But honestly, like it's too early for me to have like a favorite part of the book or like a favorite character even. But it's also just, honestly, this book from beginning to end might be in like a consistent kind of jazz time if you really read it through. And I think that deserves credit in itself, even if you're not going to read it out loud right now.
I will say this book pairs very well. If anyone is like me and has music on while they read, do yourself a favor and put on some Grant Green. It goes incredibly well with his work. I think I had which ones did I have? I had Idle Moments on for a while. Today was I just had a kind of a mix going on, but Green Street's great. All of his stuff is great. So either him or like a lot of that jazz guitar, like him and Wes Montgomery and Django Reinhardt.
I listened to some Django Reinhardt, and then if for no other reason than for the bit, I did put on the Third Man soundtrack when he got to Austria-Hungary.
I mean, it's the zither is perfect for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't think about that. That's a good call. Great score. God.
It is. It's amazing.
I'd like to take a moment to highlight that it might just be that the setting of this book is, the kind of music that Pynchon grew up steeped in, but his lyrics, for once, feel like something contemporaneous to the story that's going on.
Agreed.
Yeah.
That's a good call out.
Especially I think it's the last song that's in shit. That's something I meant to bring up too. I can't. I'll save it for when we do the actual review of the book. But the very last song in here references a play from 1917 that really ties into a lot of what the novel's getting at.
The one on 288.
Yeah, it's called "Right You Are," the 1917 play.
Because the narrative lends itself to having musical scenes a lot more than some of his other novels.
They don't feel as forced in for sure.
Yeah. This was maybe the first time for I'm not going to go so far as to say that I loved all the songs, but I do agree that they do fit. And this was maybe the first time that whenever a song did come up, I wasn't immediately groaning. Anything else anyone wants to say, or should we move on to the listener question?
Yeah, all I've got is on par with there's a character named Pebkak.
Yeah, and one named, I think his name translates to what's your name in Hungarian.
Yeah.
The names are pretty next level in this book.
There are some crazy names even for Pynchon in this book. The Delvasto woman in particular.
The one that just the name that I don't think anyone is going to take seriously anytime soon is Boynton Crosstown.
Boynton Crosstown's wild.
It's wild, and there's the hospital in Milwaukee that presumably is across the town.
Yep.
But also, it's the slightest stretch, but there's way more math in this book than people have been highlighting as of yet. Literature reviewers don't take math classes, and
not typically.
Point is very similar to dot, and dot and cross product are two of the fundamental ways to algebraically handle vectors. And Point is one of the more savvy people in the book. That's
true. Your understanding of math is always appreciated because it's never going to be me.
Yeah.
and I weep for all of you. For my math knowledge is far too limited.
So those close out our thoughts on the book. We will, of course, circle back around to Shadow Ticket and do a complete season on it. So certainly by no means are these our complete and full thoughts on the book. There will be more Shadow Ticket content in the future, but we did want to make sure that we released something for sort of our listeners to sink their teeth in from our perspectives specifically. Presuming that's what you're looking for by continuing to listen to this podcast that we do. I also do want to make special note of the fact that Penguin Press did send us copies of this book.
Yes.
So huge thank you to the people over there and for Pynchon's agency that he works with for getting us in contact with them. The books did arrive ahead of the release date, which was very appreciated, and was just a very nice gesture from his publisher to a show dedicated to his work. So huge shout out to them for furnishing us with our copies of the novel. As not always, but more often lately, we have an email from a listener. Cody, do you want to read this email from E?
Sure. It says, "Hi, folks. Listening to your podcast enriched my first ever reading of Mason and Dixon, so it was a no-brainer to return for my Vineland reread in anticipation of one battle after another. I just listened to your bonus episode and found myself nodding along to many of your points, particularly the film's artful presentation of power strata and its depiction of dedication to the revolution versus doing revolution. Because I finished rereading the book within a few days of the film's release, I picked up on a few very direct references to Vineland's text that I wanted to point out. Lockjaw's arc with the Christmas Adventurers Club seems possibly born of a very specific passage in Brock's section, quote, He'd caught a fatal glimpse of that level where everybody knew everybody else, where however political fortunes below might bloom and die, the same people, the real ones, remained year in and year out, keeping what was desirable flowing their way. Prosecutor Vaughn wanted a life there, only slowly coming to understand that for someone of his background, there would be no route to this but self-abasement, fawning, gophering, scrambling for tips, and offering up other such hints of his eagerness to be brevetted on life's battlefield to a higher rank than he would ever, by the terms of his enlistment, have deserved. Though his defects of character were many, none was quite as annoying as this naked itch to be a gentleman, kept inflamed by a stubborn denial of what everyone else knew, that no matter how much money he made, how many political offices or course credits from charm school might come his way, no one of those among whom he wished to belong would ever regard him as other than a thug whose services had hired. Page 276 in her edition. One image from Vineland that particularly resonated with me seems to have also stuck with PTA because it's one of the few, maybe only, lines of the book clearly woven into the film's dialogue, taken from our initial introduction to Prairie's grandmother. Quote, Sasha, never having known really what to make of Zoid, settling instead for a reflex head shake whenever they met, with an embarrassed laugh that seemed to mean, you are so inappropriate for my daughter that even you must see it and be as amused as I am. We're all adults after all, and we can certainly share a chuckle, can't we, Zoid? From page 56. If you'll indulge me in baseless conspiracy, which we love on the show, I have a theory on how PTA may have named two characters. First, in Sasha's backstory, we learn that Frenessie's name comes from an Artie Shaw jazz number released near the end of World War II. It's also the Spanish word for frenzy. Perfidia is Spanish for perfidy and is the name of a song from the same era, a rendition of which by Los Panchos you hear in the last act of the film as Lockjaw's blown-off face emerges over the undulating highway. More tenuous still, in my head, the most famous Willa is Willa Cather, author famous for writing about life on the American plains, or should I say the prairie. I yield my tinfoil hat to the hosts. Thank you for your work on the podcast, E. E, firstly, thank you so much for the excellent email and all the things that you brought up in here. And I'm glad that we could help with getting you through Mason and Dixon, and that you enjoyed our coverage on Vineland and one battle after another. To your points, I think you're onto something there, especially the Lockjaw and the way his depiction is portrayed in the film versus the book. I think you highlighted a very crucial part of the book that kind of shows the parallel between those two. And the naming of Sasha and Perfidia and Fernessi is all spot on. So thank you so much for that, and hopefully we'll hear more from you going forward for other episodes.
Yeah, I certainly doff my tinfoil cap to you over that stuff about the names at the end. That was great.
I would doff mine, but then they'll start to get my thoughts. So
yeah, I think you are spot on with every interpretation you've shared. So please write in if you have a bid for replacing one of us. We all have a price.
Some less than others. Yes.
Cody's like a dollar, and I'm out of here.
You give me $1, and I'm done. I'll take it.
I could see the Willa thing being true. Honestly, I mean, it makes a strange amount of sense.
100%,
definitely.
Yeah, and especially the quote that you pulled out for the Brock Lockjaw relationship thematically really reminds me of the scene where he's being interviewed by the other Christmas adventurers, where it's just he is so obviously not these other people that it's like it's not even close. Even just down to his weird grunting that he does through the entirety of that scene when he speaks.
Yeah.
It really brought that particular scene to mind. We did also receive a YouTube comment from David Aguilar Rodriguez 87 to our One Battle After Another episode. Will, do you want to read this person's comment?
Sure. Was excited for it. Thought it was good, not great. Feel like the critical reaction is insanely overblown. Feels like 3 movies jammed together. 1, a hilarious satire centered on a great Sean Penn performance about him as a crazy fascist getting Looney Tunes chased by the white supremacy club he wants to join. 2, a mediocre art house Taken with a mad Leo performance and no emotional stakes and thin family characters, but with an exceptional chase scene. And 3, an excellent short film about Benicio del Toro as Latino Harriet Tubman. And what I will say is that what you've just described is three different stories, all about pursuit, all centered around how race interacts with the way that those pursuits affect the people who are at the center of those pursuits. And you actually, the way you outlined it, I think makes an argument for them all being one story, given that you have a nice gradient of racialization in the characters, going from least to most racialized. So, got you. I turned your words against you. But also,
I mean, it is one battle after another, and those are the three battles. And
Yeah,
three
that's
battles
true.
are a lot for one movie. So
that's true. But I will say, jokes aside, everyone's allowed to not love any piece of art.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like just because it connected for all four of us and for a few other people doesn't mean that you're wrong or that we think you're wrong, or we think you're wrong. But like I said, I think you've made a great case for why you are wrong.
I will say the description of the Lockjaw arc of the story being a crazy fascist getting Looney Tunes chased by the white supremacy club he wants to join is pretty fucking hilarious and spot on.
art house
Alright.
taking is a pretty fun phrase as well.
That's true. I'd love to see an SNL sketch of that. I don't know if I would want to see an entire film of an art house taken, but a short sketch would be pretty fun.
Mm-hmm.
That is all that we have for this episode for you guys. Thank you so much as always for listening. Next episode we will be releasing is going to be back to our sort of regularly scheduled content. That's going to be chapters 22 and 23 of Against the Day. We'll continue sort of riding through that book, not just for now, but also for a couple years.
Foreseeable future.
If you like what we're doing and you want to support the show, if you think our show's worth $1, we'd love to have it. Please consider making a donation to us on Ko-Fi. Any funds we receive will be used to upgrade our equipment and pay hosting fees and just help make the show generally better. And you can get in contact with us just like these two listeners did, any number of ways. The most direct route is emailing us at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. We can also be reached on Blue Sky at Mapping the Zone, on Twitter at PinchOnPod, on Instagram at Mapping the Zone Podcast. And we do also have merch. I do a terrible job of telling people that if they really love this shirt, this is why you shouldn't buy a shirt. Jesus Christ!
Freudian.
Oh, man.
Oh, better believe that stay in the edit.
If you really love this show enough to buy a shirt, then you absolutely can do so. We have a spreadshirt underneath our podcast name that is mappingthezone.myspreadshop.com. There are shirts, there are tote bags, there are hoodies, and all sorts of fun stuff on there. If you love us enough to show off our lovely art, either on your own body or in your own home. And of course, thank you to Brad per second on Reddit for designing our lovely show cover. As always, thank you so much for listening.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya.
And coming soon from Cultured Foods, the Zoot Suit of... Oh, Jesus Christ. This other product you came up with is... I did like 2-3 test runs of this before I actually recorded it, hoping that I could get through the last line properly.